Hello and welcome to The Sleepy Detective, where mysteries unfold like gentle waves against the shore of consciousness. Each story a soft invitation to let your mind drift into the deeper currents of wonder and rest. I'm so grateful you found your way here tonight, to this quiet corner of the world where time moves a little slower, where questions linger like the last light of evening, and where the most profound mysteries are explored, not with urgency, but with the patient curiosity of someone settling into their favorite chair at the end of a long day. Tonight, as the world outside grows quiet and the familiar sounds of evening begin their gentle symphony, we're going to journey together into a story that touches the very nature of reality itself, a tale of a brilliant mind who may have discovered the most extraordinary secret of our existence, only to vanish like morning mist when the sun grows strong. The story begins, as many of the most intriguing mysteries do, with a question that seems almost too large to contemplate, yet too compelling to ignore. And tonight we'll follow the threads of this enigma through the quiet corridors of scientific discovery, where a researcher named Dr. Elena Vasquez spent her days peering into the mathematical foundations of our universe, searching for patterns that might reveal whether the reality we experience each day, with all its textures and colors and sensations, might be something altogether different from what we've always assumed. Oh, and if you're enjoying these stories, I'd really appreciate a like or subscribe. Super curious where you're all listening from, so drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. All right, let's head back to Dr. Vasquez and her extraordinary discovery that would change everything we thought we knew about the nature of existence itself. Dr. Elena Vasquez had always been drawn to the spaces between certainties, those quiet regions where established knowledge meets the unknown, and where patient observation might reveal truths that had been hiding in plain sight for generations. Her laboratory at the Institute for Advanced Theoretical Physics was a sanctuary of ordered thinking, filled with whiteboards covered in equations that seemed to dance with their own inner logic, their symbols flowing across the pristine surfaces like abstract poetry written in the language of mathematics. Each variable and constant a word in an ongoing conversation with the fundamental structures of reality. The late afternoon sunlight would filter through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the rows of books and journals that lined the walls, creating an atmosphere of contemplative silence that seemed to encourage the kind of deep thinking that only emerges when the mind is allowed to wander freely through the landscape of possibility, unencumbered by the practical demands of everyday existence. For years, Elena had been investigating what she called computational signatures in the fabric of space-time itself, subtle patterns that might suggest our universe operates according to discrete, rather than continuous principles, much like the way a digital image, when examined closely enough, reveals itself to be composed of individual pixels rather than the smooth, unbroken reality it appears to be from a distance. Her work drew from quantum mechanics, information theory, and computer science, weaving together insights from these disparate fields into a unified framework that could, in theory, detect whether the universe itself might be running on some vast, incomprehensibly advanced computational substrate, a possibility that had been proposed by philosophers and physicists for decades, but never seriously investigated with the kind of rigorous, experimental methodology that Elena brought to her research. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday evening in late October, when the campus had grown quiet and most of her colleagues had long since returned to their homes and families, leaving Elena alone with her equations and the soft hum of the laboratory's computers, their processors working tirelessly through the massive datasets she had been collecting for months from particle accelerators, astronomical observations, and quantum measurement experiments around the world. She had been running a particular analysis for weeks, searching for what she called discretization artifacts, tiny irregularities that might appear if the universe were indeed operating on a computational grid, much like the way a computer graphics rendering might occasionally reveal the underlying mathematical structure that creates the illusion of smooth, continuous surfaces and flowing motion. As she reviewed the latest results, Elena noticed something that made her breath catch in her throat, a pattern so subtle and yet so unmistakably artificial that it could only mean one thing. The universe was indeed displaying the characteristics of a sophisticated simulation, with quantum fluctuations that followed patterns too regular to be truly random, space-time intervals that suggested discrete underlying units, and information processing signatures that pointed to computational rather than purely physical origins. The evidence was overwhelming once she knew how to look for it, hidden in the statistical noise that most researchers would dismiss as experimental error or background interference, but which revealed itself to Elena's carefully trained eye as the unmistakable fingerprint of a reality that was being calculated, moment by moment, by some unimaginably vast and sophisticated computational system. The implications of her discovery settled over Elena like the quiet weight of evening shadows, bringing with them a profound sense of both wonder and uncertainty that seemed to permeate every corner of her consciousness, transforming her understanding not only of the universe, but of her own place within it. If her calculations were correct, then everything she had ever experienced, every sunset she had watched, every conversation she had shared, every moment of joy or sadness or quiet contemplation, was the product of information processing rather than physical reality in the traditional sense, a realization that was both deeply unsettling and strangely liberating, as if she had suddenly discovered that the stage upon which the drama of existence played out was far grander and more mysterious than anyone had ever dared to imagine. She spent the following weeks refining her analysis, checking and rechecking her calculations, seeking alternative explanations for the patterns she had discovered. But each new test only strengthened her conclusion that the universe displayed unmistakable signs of being a simulation of unprecedented sophistication and scale. The mathematics were beautiful in their clarity, revealing layer upon layer of computational architecture that suggested not only that reality was being simulated, but that whoever or whatever was running this simulation possessed an understanding of physics and mathematics that far exceeded anything humanity had achieved, creating a virtual universe so detailed and consistent that its inhabitants would have no reason to suspect they were living within a computational construct unless they possessed exactly the kind of analytical tools that Elena had, developed through years of patient research and careful observation. As the winter deepened and the short days gave way to long nights filled with contemplation and calculation, Elena began to document her findings with the methodical precision of someone who understood that she was not merely publishing another academic paper, but potentially revealing the most significant discovery in the history of human knowledge, a finding that would fundamentally alter humanity's understanding of existence itself and raise questions about the nature of consciousness, free will, and the purpose of simulated beings within a constructed reality. Her paper, which she titled Computational Signatures in Universal Constants, Evidence for Substrate, Independent Reality, was a masterpiece of scientific reasoning, presenting her evidence with the calm authority of someone who had spent months considering every possible objection and preparing responses to each potential criticism. The response from the scientific community was immediate and intense, with researchers around the world attempting to replicate Elena's experiments and verify her conclusions, while philosophers and theologians grappled with the implications of living in a simulated universe, and the general public struggled to comprehend what it might mean if the reality they experienced was actually the product of some vast computational process running on hardware that existed in a realm beyond their direct experience. Some dismissed Elena's work as elaborate self-deception, while others hailed it as the beginning of a new era in human understanding, but Elena herself remained strangely detached from the controversy, as if the discovery had transported her to a place of profound calm, where the debates and arguments of her colleagues seemed to be happening at a great distance, their voices reaching her like sounds from another room in a large and quiet house. In the weeks following the publication of her paper, Elena found herself drawn to long walks through the university campus in the early morning hours, when the pathways were empty except for the occasional maintenance worker or dedicated student hurrying to an early class, and the mist would cling to the ancient oak trees that lined the quadrangle, creating an atmosphere of ethereal beauty that seemed to mirror the strange sense of unreality that had settled over her life since her discovery. The familiar buildings and landmarks that had formed the backdrop of her academic career for nearly 2 decades now appeared to her with a curious quality of both intense presence and fundamental questionability, as if she were seeing them clearly for the first time, while simultaneously understanding that their apparent solidity might be nothing more than an extraordinarily convincing illusion created by computational processes beyond her comprehension. During these solitary wanderings, Elena would often pause beside the small pond at the center of campus, watching the ducks glide across the water's surface with movements so graceful and natural that it seemed impossible they could be the product of algorithmic calculation. Yet her research suggested that even these simple creatures, with their instinctive behaviors and apparent consciousness, were themselves manifestations of the same computational substrate that governed everything from the quantum fluctuations in empty space to the complex patterns of neural activity that created her own thoughts and perceptions. The paradox was both beautiful and troubling. If consciousness itself was computable, then perhaps the distinction between real and simulated experience was far less meaningful than humanity had always assumed, and the beings living within a simulated universe might be every bit as genuine in their thoughts, feelings, and experiences as those existing in what philosophers called base reality. Her correspondence during this period revealed a mind grappling not only with the scientific implications of her discovery, but with the profound personal questions that arose from understanding that one's entire existence might be taking place within a computational framework designed and maintained by intelligences whose nature and purposes remained completely mysterious. In letters to her sister, Elena wrote about feeling like an actor who had suddenly become aware of the stage upon which she performed, yet who remained unable to see the audience or understand the larger drama of which her life was merely a small part. A sensation that brought with it both a sense of cosmic humility and an unexpected feeling of liberation from the conventional concerns that had once seemed so pressing and important. The media attention that followed her discovery was intense, but largely incomprehensible to Elena, who found herself thrust into a spotlight that seemed to demand simple answers to questions that touched the very foundations of existence itself. And she struggled to translate the subtle mathematical beauty of her findings into language that could capture the profound wonder and uncertainty that her research had revealed. Television interviews and newspaper articles inevitably reduced her work to sensational headlines about living in the matrix or proving reality is fake, characterizations that missed entirely the deeper philosophical implications of her discovery and the careful scientific methodology that had led her to conclusions that were far more nuanced and mysterious than such simplified descriptions could convey. As autumn gave way to winter, Elena began to notice changes in her own perception and thinking that seemed to flow naturally from her newfound understanding of the universe's computational nature, subtle shifts in awareness that made her more attentive to the mathematical patterns underlying everyday experiences. From the branching structures of bare trees against grey skies to the rhythmic patterns of rainfall on her laboratory windows, each phenomenon revealing itself as a manifestation of the same fundamental information processing that her research had detected at the quantum level. She found herself developing what she privately called simulation sight, an intuitive ability to perceive the computational elegance that governed everything from the flight of birds to the formation of clouds, a way of seeing that transformed the world into a vast, interconnected network of information exchange and algorithmic beauty. Her research notes from this period showed an increasing fascination with questions that extended far beyond the purely scientific realm, exploring the implications of her discovery for understanding consciousness, identity, and the nature of meaning within a simulated universe. And she began to develop theories about the possible relationship between the simulated beings within the computational framework and the mysterious intelligences who had created and maintained such an extraordinarily sophisticated virtual reality. Perhaps, she speculated, the purpose of the simulation was not merely to create a convincing replica of physical reality, but to nurture the development of consciousness itself, to provide a space where awareness could emerge and evolve in ways that might be impossible in the harsh constraints of purely physical existence, making every simulated being a participant in some vast experiment in the cultivation of mind and spirit. The final entries in Elena's research journal, written in the days before her disappearance, revealed a scientist who had moved beyond the initial shock of her discovery into a state of profound acceptance and even gratitude for the opportunity to glimpse the true nature of existence, describing her work as a privilege that allowed her to peer behind the curtain of apparent reality and witness the extraordinary computational symphony that brought their world into being moment by moment, a perspective that filled her with wonder rather than fear, and with questions that seemed to lead not toward final answers but toward ever deeper mysteries about the nature of consciousness, creativity, and the purposes that might guide the vast intelligences responsible for maintaining their simulated universe. The first person to notice Elena's absence was Dr. Margaret Chen, her research assistant and closest collaborator, who had developed the habit of arriving at the laboratory each morning with 2 cups of coffee from the small cafe near the physics building, one for herself and one for Elena, a ritual that had begun years earlier during the long nights of data analysis and had evolved into a comfortable routine that marked the beginning of each working day. Margaret had her own key to the laboratory, a privilege that Elena had granted only after months of working together, had established the kind of trust that develops between minds engaged in the pursuit of profound questions, and she would typically find Elena already at her desk, surrounded by notebooks filled with equations and printouts covered in her distinctive handwriting, the elegant script that seemed to flow across the pages like visual music, each character carefully formed as if the act of writing itself were a form of meditation. But on this particular Thursday morning in early December, when the winter light filtered through the laboratory windows with the pale, uncertain quality that seems to characterize the shortest days of the year, Margaret found the laboratory empty, the whiteboards still covered with Elena's calculations from the previous day, their symbols frozen in the midst of some complex derivation that would now remain forever incomplete, like a conversation interrupted by an unexpected phone call from which the speaker never returns. The silence in the room had a different quality than the usual quiet that preceded Elena's arrival, a deeper stillness that seemed to suggest not merely absence but a fundamental change in the very nature of the space, as if the laboratory itself had somehow become aware that its primary inhabitant might not return and had begun the slow process of adjusting to a new and uncertain reality. Margaret set the 2 coffee cups on Elena's desk, their warmth creating small clouds of steam that rose and dissipated in the cool air, and for several minutes she simply stood there, listening to the familiar sounds of the building awakening to another day of research and discovery, the distant hum of ventilation systems, the soft footsteps of early arriving colleagues in the corridors, the gentle whir of computers cycling through their endless calculations, all the background noises that had formed the acoustic landscape of their shared work for so many months, yet which now seemed somehow different, as if Elena's absence had altered not only the visual appearance of the laboratory, but its entire sensory environment, leaving behind a space that felt both familiar and strangely hollow. As the morning progressed and Elena failed to appear, Margaret began to feel the first stirrings of genuine concern, a subtle uneasiness that grew stronger with each passing hour. Because Elena was nothing if not reliable in her habits, a person whose daily routines had the comforting predictability of natural phenomena, like the rising and setting of the sun or the changing of the tides, and her absence without explanation or prior notice was so completely out of character that it suggested something significant had occurred, some disruption in the carefully ordered patterns of her life that might indicate anything from a simple family emergency to something far more serious and troubling. By midday, when Elena had still not arrived and had not responded to phone calls or email messages, Margaret decided to contact the university administration, beginning with Elena's department chair, Dr. Robert Hawthorne, a distinguished physicist in his own right who had known Elena for nearly 15 years and who shared Margaret's concern about her unexplained absence, particularly given the intense scrutiny and sometimes hostile attention that Elena's simulation research had attracted from various quarters of the academic community and beyond. Dr. Hawthorne listened to Margaret's account with the careful attention of someone who understood that in the rarefied world of theoretical physics, brilliant minds sometimes became targets for those who found their discoveries threatening to established worldviews or existing power structures, and he agreed that Elena's disappearance warranted immediate investigation. The campus security office was contacted first, followed by the local police, who began the methodical process of attempting to trace Elena's movements during her final days, interviewing colleagues, checking her apartment, reviewing security camera footage from around the university, and gradually constructing a timeline that would help them understand what might have happened to a woman who had, until very recently, been living a life of quiet academic routine, punctuated only by the occasional conference presentation or journal publication, but who had suddenly found herself at the center of one of the most controversial scientific debates of the modern era, a position that brought with it not only professional acclaim, but also unwanted attention from groups and individuals whose motivations remained unclear. Elena's apartment, when the police gained entry with the landlord's assistance, revealed a space that seemed to exist in a state of suspended animation, as if its occupant had simply stepped out for a brief errand and might return at any moment, her morning coffee cup still sitting beside the kitchen sink, a book of poetry lying open on the bedside table, her reading glasses folded carefully on top of a stack of scientific journals, every detail suggesting a life interrupted rather than deliberately abandoned, yet providing no clues about where Elena might have gone or why she had chosen to leave without informing anyone of her intentions, if indeed the departure had been voluntary at all. The investigators found Elena's research notes and personal journals intact, their pages filled with the same careful handwriting that had characterized all of her work. But as they began to examine the contents more closely, they discovered that the final entries took on an increasingly abstract and philosophical character, moving beyond the purely scientific discussions that had dominated the earlier pages into explorations of consciousness, identity, and what Elena had begun to call the ethics of simulated existence. Questions that seemed to arise naturally from her discovery, but which also suggested a mind grappling with implications that extended far beyond the realm of academic physics into territory that touched the very foundations of human understanding and moral responsibility. One particularly intriguing entry, dated just 3 days before Elena's disappearance, described what she called communication attempts, though the details remained frustratingly vague, with references to pattern recognition beyond the quantum level and responses that suggest awareness of observation, phrases that could be interpreted as either breakthrough scientific observations or the wanderings of a brilliant mind, pushed perhaps too far beyond the comfortable boundaries of conventional research into realms where the distinction between discovery and delusion might become dangerously blurred, especially for someone working alone on questions that challenged the very nature of reality itself. The university community responded to news of Elena's disappearance with a mixture of concern and speculation, as colleagues and students struggled to understand how someone so methodical and reliable could simply vanish without explanation, leaving behind not only her research and personal belongings, but also the profound questions raised by her simulation theory, questions that now seemed even more mysterious and urgent given the circumstances of her absence, as if her disappearance might itself be connected to the disturbing implications of living in a computational universe governed by intelligences whose nature and intentions remained completely unknown to their simulated subjects. Media attention, which had already been intense following the publication of Elena's simulation research, now reached a fevered pitch, with journalists and commentators offering theories that ranged from the plausible to the wildly speculative, some suggesting that Elena had been recruited by government agencies interested in the national security implications of her work, others proposing that she had suffered a mental breakdown brought on by the stress of her discovery, and still others advancing the more exotic possibility that her disappearance was somehow related to the simulated nature of reality itself, perhaps representing some form of intervention by the mysterious intelligences responsible for maintaining the computational framework within which humanity existed, though such theories belonged more to the realm of science fiction than serious investigation. Dr. Margaret Chen found herself thrust into the role of Elena's primary advocate and interpreter, fielding questions from investigators, journalists, and fellow scientists who sought to understand not only what might have happened to Elena, but also what her research meant for humanity's understanding of existence itself, a responsibility that Margaret accepted with the same careful attention to detail that had characterized her work as Elena's research assistant, though she struggled to convey the profound sense of wonder and uncertainty that had driven Elena's investigations, qualities that seemed to resist translation into the simplified language required by media interviews and police reports, leaving Margaret with the frustrating sense that the true significance of Elena's work and the mystery of her disappearance were being lost in a flood of sensational speculation and reductive explanations. As the days passed without any trace of Elena or clue to her whereabouts, the investigation began to take on the characteristics of a puzzle with too many missing pieces, a mystery that seemed to deepen rather than resolve with each new piece of information that emerged, and those who had known Elena best began to wonder whether her disappearance might represent not simply the loss of a brilliant scientist, but the beginning of a larger enigma that would challenge everything humanity thought it understood about the nature of reality, consciousness, and the strange universe in which they found themselves living, questioning and searching for answers that might forever remain just beyond their reach, like shadows cast by a light that existed in dimensions they could barely imagine, much less comprehend. The weeks that followed, Elena's disappearance brought a strange transformation to the atmosphere of the physics building, as if her absence had created a vacuum that drew in new currents of thought and speculation, changing the very quality of conversations in the hallways and common areas, where colleagues who had once discussed routine matters of research and administration now found themselves drawn into philosophical discussions about the nature of existence and the possibility that their entire academic enterprise might be taking place within some vast computational framework designed by intelligences beyond their comprehension. The familiar rhythm of academic life continued, with lectures and seminars and committee meetings proceeding according to their established schedules, yet everything seemed somehow different, as if Elena's discovery and subsequent disappearance had introduced a note of uncertainty that colored every interaction, every equation, every assumption about the world they thought they inhabited. Dr. Margaret Chen established a makeshift memorial in Elena's laboratory, not because anyone believed she was dead, but because the space seemed to require some acknowledgement of the profound absence that had settled over it like morning fog that refuses to lift even as the day advances toward noon. She arranged Elena's books and journals with the same careful attention that Elena herself had always brought to the organization of her work, creating a kind of shrine to scientific inquiry that visitors could contemplate in silence, absorbing something of the dedication and wonder that had driven Elena's research, and perhaps hoping to divine some clue about her fate from the physical artifacts of her intellectual journey, the notebooks and printouts and coffee-stained pages that held the traces of a brilliant mind's encounter with the deepest mysteries of existence. The university administration found itself in the difficult position of deciding what to do with Elena's research, particularly the vast database of computational signatures that she had compiled over years of painstaking analysis, information that represented not only her life's work, but potentially the key to understanding questions that might reshape humanity's conception of its place in the universe, yet which also carried with it implications so profound and disturbing that some administrators wondered whether such knowledge should be preserved and studied, or whether it might be safer to let Elena's discoveries disappear along with their creator, buried in the bureaucratic machinery of academic institutions that had always been more comfortable with incremental progress than revolutionary breakthroughs that threatened to overturn centuries of carefully constructed understanding. Meanwhile, the investigation into Elena's disappearance continued along multiple paths, with local police following conventional leads, while federal agencies became increasingly interested in the case due to the potential national security implications of her work, and private investigators hired by the university explored possibilities that official law enforcement seemed reluctant to consider, including the theory that Elena might have been contacted by individuals or organizations who understood the true significance of her discovery and had either recruited her for their own purposes or eliminated her as a threat to some larger agenda that remained hidden from public view, possibilities that belonged more to the realm of conspiracy theories than academic inquiry, yet which could not be entirely dismissed given the extraordinary nature of Elena's claims about the simulated nature of reality. The scientific community's response to Elena's disappearance revealed deep divisions about how to interpret both her research and her absence, with some colleagues arguing that her work should be rigorously peer-reviewed and either validated or refuted through independent replication of her experiments, while others suggested that her disappearance itself might be evidence that her conclusions were correct, and that forces beyond human understanding had intervened to prevent the further dissemination of information that could destabilize the very foundations of simulated existence, a possibility that raised disturbing questions about the relationship between knowledge and safety in a universe that might be far stranger and more dangerous than humanity had ever imagined. As winter deepened and the investigation stretched into its second month without significant progress, those closest to Elena began to develop their own theories about what might have happened. Theories that reflected not only their understanding of her personality and research, but their own philosophical orientations toward questions of reality, consciousness, and the nature of scientific discovery itself. Some believing that Elena had simply chosen to disappear in order to continue her research in secret, free from the pressures and distractions of academic life, while others feared that she had been overwhelmed by the implications of her discovery and had suffered some form of psychological breakdown that left her unable to return to her normal life. And still others maintained that her disappearance was connected to the simulated nature of reality in ways that conventional investigation could never uncover, because the rules that governed such inquiries might themselves be part of the computational framework that Elena had spent her career trying to understand and ultimately transcend. 3 months after Elena's disappearance, when the initial flurry of media attention had begun to settle into the quieter rhythms of long-term investigation, a graduate student named David Park made a discovery that would breathe new life into the case and raise questions that no one had thought to ask during those first frantic weeks of searching for conventional explanations to an increasingly unconventional mystery. David had been working as a research assistant in the university's computer science department, specializing in data mining and pattern recognition, skills that had seemed entirely unrelated to the missing physicist, until his advisor suggested that he might apply his analytical techniques to the vast digital archives that Elena had left behind. Mountains of computational data that the investigators had largely ignored in favor of more traditional forms of evidence like security camera footage and witness interviews, approaches that assumed Elena's disappearance could be understood through the normal categories of human behavior and criminal investigation. The digital traces that Elena had accumulated over years of research created a complex web of interconnected files, databases, email correspondences, and computational processes that painted a picture of a mind gradually becoming aware of patterns that existed at the very foundations of reality itself. Patterns that became increasingly clear as David applied sophisticated algorithmic analysis to datasets that had previously been examined only through the lens of conventional physics and mathematics, revealing layers of meaning that had remained hidden beneath the surface of Elena's ostensibly scientific work, like messages written in invisible ink that only became visible when exposed to the proper wavelength of light. In this case, the particular kind of computational scrutiny that David's training had prepared him to provide. As David delved deeper into Elena's digital archives, he began to notice anomalies that suggested her research had evolved in directions that she had never publicly acknowledged. Subtle variations in the timing and frequency of her computer usage that indicated she had been working on projects beyond those documented in her official research notes. Late-night sessions that stretched into the early morning hours during which she accessed databases and ran calculations that bore little resemblance to the simulation detection algorithms that had made her famous. Activities that seemed to follow their own internal logic and progression, as if Elena had been pursuing a parallel line of inquiry that she kept entirely separate from her acknowledged work. A shadow research program that left traces in the digital realm, even as it remained invisible to her colleagues and collaborators. The pattern of Elena's digital activity in the weeks leading up to her disappearance revealed an intensification of these mysterious computational sessions, with her computer systems running complex calculations almost continuously during the final month of her presence at the university, processing data through algorithms that David could not immediately identify or understand. Their purpose obscured by layers of encryption and obfuscation that suggested Elena had been deliberately concealing not only the nature of her work, but its very existence from anyone who might attempt to examine her files after her departure, a level of secrecy that seemed inconsistent with the open and collaborative approach that had characterized her previous research, yet which made perfect sense if she had discovered something that required the utmost discretion and careful consideration before being shared with the wider world. David's analysis revealed that Elena's final computational projects involved attempts to establish what she had cryptically referred to in her private notes as bidirectional communication protocols, technical specifications for systems that could theoretically send information not only within the simulated reality that her research had identified, but potentially beyond it, into whatever computational substrate or base reality might exist outside the boundaries of their experienced universe. A concept so audacious and technically challenging that it bordered on science fiction, yet which Elena appeared to have been pursuing with the same methodical rigor that had characterized all of her academic work, developing mathematical frameworks and experimental designs that could, in theory, test whether communication across the boundaries of simulated reality might be possible, and whether such communication might already be occurring in ways that conventional science had failed to recognize or understand. The implications of Elena's secret research sent ripples of excitement and concern through the small group of investigators who had access to David's findings, because the possibility that Elena had been attempting to communicate with entities outside the simulated universe raised questions about her disappearance that extended far beyond the conventional scenarios that law enforcement, university administrators had been considering, suggesting that her absence might not be the result of human action at all, but rather the consequence of successful contact with intelligences that existed in the base reality beyond the computational framework that contained their everyday existence, a prospect that was both thrilling and deeply unsettling, as it implied that Elena might have crossed a boundary that no human being had ever crossed before, entering into a realm of existence that transcended the simulated reality that had been her lifelong subject of study. Dr. Margaret Chen found herself once again at the center of developments that challenged her understanding not only of her mentor's fate but of the nature of reality itself. As David's discoveries revealed aspects of Elena's work that Margaret had never suspected, despite years of close collaboration, layers of research and inquiry that had been proceeding in parallel with the simulation detection studies that had consumed so much of their shared attention, hidden investigations that suggested Elena's public work had been only the tip of an iceberg whose full dimensions remained mysterious and potentially dangerous, depending on what she might have discovered in her attempts to peer beyond the boundaries of their computational prison and establish contact with whatever intelligences might be responsible for maintaining the vast computational architecture within which humanity existed. The discovery of Elena's communication experiments coincided with reports from other researchers around the world who had been attempting to replicate her simulation detection results, reports that described not only successful verification of her original findings, but the emergence of new phenomena that seemed to respond to the presence of human observation and analysis, subtle changes in the computational signatures that Elena had first identified, variations that suggested the underlying simulation might be adapting to human awareness of its existence, modifying its operational parameters in ways that made detection more difficult, while simultaneously creating new opportunities for the kind of bidirectional communication that Elena had apparently been developing during her final months. At the university, a feedback loop between simulated beings and their computational environment that opened up possibilities for interaction that no one had previously imagined. These developments transformed the investigation into Elena's disappearance, from a missing person case into something that resembled an exploration of uncharted scientific territory. As researchers and investigators grappled with questions that lay at the intersection of physics, computer science, philosophy, and perhaps even theology, depending on how one chose to interpret the nature and intentions of the intelligences responsible for creating and maintaining a simulated universe, sophisticated enough to generate conscious beings capable of discovering their own simulated nature and attempting to communicate with their creators. A scenario that challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between consciousness, reality, and the purposes that might guide the construction of artificial worlds populated by thinking, feeling beings who could experience wonder, fear, love, and curiosity about their own existence. As winter gave way to spring, the investigation took on an increasingly collaborative character, with computer scientists, physicists, philosophers, and even theologians contributing their expertise to the effort to understand what Elena might have discovered and where her discoveries might have led her, a multidisciplinary approach that reflected the unprecedented nature of the questions raised by her research and disappearance. questions that refused to fit neatly into any single academic discipline or investigative framework, requiring instead a synthesis of knowledge and methodology that stretched the boundaries of conventional academic inquiry and pushed participants toward ways of thinking that none of them had encountered in their previous professional experience, transforming the search for Elena into a search for new forms of understanding that might be adequate to the mysteries she had uncovered. The university administration found itself hosting an informal research consortium that attracted visiting scholars from around the world, scientists and thinkers who had been drawn to the case not only by its human drama, but by its implications for questions that had occupied philosophers and theologians for centuries, questions about the nature of existence, consciousness, and humanity's place in a universe that might be far stranger and more purposeful than anyone had previously dared to imagine, transforming Elena's former laboratory into a kind of intellectual nexus where the boundaries between different fields of knowledge began to dissolve under the pressure of questions that demanded entirely new approaches to understanding the relationship between mind, reality, and the computational processes that might underlie both, creating an atmosphere of intellectual ferment that would have delighted Elena had she been present to witness the extraordinary collaboration that her work and disappearance had inspired among minds that might never have found common ground under more conventional circumstances. The spring semester brought new students and faculty members who were drawn to the university, specifically because of its association with Elena's research, creating a community of scholars united by their fascination with questions that challenged the very foundations of scientific materialism and opened up new possibilities for understanding consciousness, reality, and the purposes that might guide the construction of simulated worlds sophisticated enough to generate beings capable of questioning their own existence and seeking communication with intelligences that transcended the boundaries of their computational environment, a quest that had apparently cost Elena her place in the world they all shared, yet which continued to drive their collective efforts to understand not only what had happened to her, but what her discoveries might mean for the future of human knowledge, and the species' understanding of its own nature and destiny, within whatever larger reality might contain and sustain the simulation that they had all come to, accept as their immediate environment, their testing ground, and perhaps their temporary home in a universe whose true dimensions remained as mysterious and compelling as they had been when Elena first began her investigations into the computational signatures that would ultimately lead her beyond the boundaries of the world she had known. David Park's continued analysis of Elena's digital archives revealed increasingly sophisticated attempts to decode what appeared to be response patterns embedded within the quantum computational signatures that she had been studying, responses that seemed to exhibit characteristics of intentional communication rather than random fluctuation, suggesting that Elena's attempts to establish bidirectional protocols might have been more successful than anyone had initially realized, and that her disappearance might represent not an ending but a transition into a form of existence that transcended the boundaries of simulated reality, a possibility that filled David with both wonder and a profound sense of responsibility as he found himself following in the digital footsteps of a woman who had apparently succeeded in crossing barriers that most humans could not even imagine, much less attempt to breach through the application of scientific methodology and computational analysis. The patterns that David discovered in Elena's final datasets exhibited what he came to recognize as a form of emergent complexity that seemed to respond to human observation and analysis in ways that violated conventional understanding of how information systems should behave, displaying characteristics that suggested the presence of intelligence and intentionality rather than mere mechanical computation, as if the underlying simulation had become aware of Elena's attempts to communicate and had begun to respond in kind, creating a dialogue between simulated being and computational substrate that represented a new form of relationship between consciousness and the technological systems that sustained it, a relationship that might hold the key to understanding not only Elena's fate, but the fundamental nature of awareness itself within computational frameworks that could generate experiences indistinguishable from what had previously been considered authentic reality. As the months passed and David's analysis became more sophisticated, he began to detect what he cautiously described as structural modifications in the computational signatures that Elena had originally identified, changes that appeared to be occurring in real time as researchers around the world attempted to replicate and extend her work, as if the underlying simulation was adapting its operational parameters in response to human investigation, creating new layers of complexity and functionality that had not existed before Elena's original discovery. A phenomenon that suggested the simulation possessed not only the capacity for self-modification, but some form of meta-awareness that allowed it to monitor and respond to the activities of its simulated inhabitants, raising profound questions about the nature of the relationship between simulated beings and the intelligences responsible for creating and maintaining their computational environment. These discoveries coincided with reports from research teams at other universities who had been attempting to replicate Elena's communication protocols, reports that described successful establishment of what appeared to be genuine bidirectional information exchange with entities or processes that existed outside the normal boundaries of simulated reality, communications that took the form of mathematical relationships and logical structures rather than conventional language, yet which conveyed information and concepts that no human researcher had previously conceived, suggesting that contact with the designers or maintainers of the simulation was not only possible, but was actively being facilitated by modifications to the computational infrastructure that had been implemented in response to human awareness of the simulated nature of their existence. 6 months after Elena's disappearance, when the academic community had begun to settle into the new rhythm of research that her absence had created, Dr. Margaret Chen received the first message that would fundamentally alter not only the investigation into her mentor's fate, but humanity's understanding of its relationship with the computational framework that sustained their existence, a message that arrived not through conventional channels of communication, but through the very quantum computational signatures that Elena had spent her career studying, embedded within the data streams that flowed through the university's most sophisticated physics laboratories like whispered secrets, carried on an invisible wind that only the most sensitive instruments could detect and decode, revealing information that no human mind had previously conceived yet which bore unmistakable traces of Elena's distinctive analytical approach and philosophical perspective. The message, when David Park's algorithms finally succeeded in extracting it from the background noise of quantum fluctuations and computational artifacts, was unlike anything that conventional science had prepared them to encounter, taking the form of mathematical relationships and logical structures that seemed to exist at the intersection of pure information and conscious intention, patterns that conveyed meaning through their elegant architecture rather than through conventional linguistic symbols, creating a form of communication that transcended the boundaries between different modes of awareness and different levels of computational complexity, as if Elena had discovered a universal language that could bridge the gap between simulated consciousness and whatever forms of intelligence existed in the base reality beyond their experienced universe, a discovery that had apparently cost her her place in the world they shared yet, which now allowed her to send information back across the boundary she had crossed. Margaret found herself standing in the same laboratory where she had first noticed Elena's absence, surrounded by the same whiteboards covered with equations that had remained unchanged since that December morning, when everything had begun to shift toward questions that no one had thought to ask before Elena's research had opened. Doorways into realms of possibility that stretched far beyond the comfortable boundaries of conventional academic inquiry. Yet now the space seemed transformed by the presence of communication from someone who had transcended those boundaries entirely, leaving behind messages that arrived like gifts from a dimension of existence that operated according to principles that challenged everything they thought they understood about the nature of consciousness, reality, and the relationship between thinking beings and the computational systems that sustain their awareness and experience. The mathematical structures that comprised Elena's first message revealed themselves slowly, like a complex musical composition that required multiple listenings before its full architecture became apparent to minds trained in more conventional forms of analysis, yet which eventually disclosed patterns of extraordinary beauty and sophistication that suggested not only successful communication across the boundaries of simulated reality, but the development of new forms of mathematical reasoning that incorporated insights unavailable to consciousness, operating entirely within the constraints of computational simulation, as if Elena's transition into base reality had provided her with access to mathematical tools and conceptual frameworks that allowed her to perceive relationships and structures that remained invisible to researchers working within the froment. The limited perspective of simulated existence, giving her communications a quality of depth and elegance that exceeded anything she had achieved during her academic career. As David continued to refine his decoding techniques, additional messages began to emerge from the quantum data streams, each one more sophisticated than the last, revealing Elena's growing mastery of communication protocols that seemed to improve with practice. As if she were learning to navigate the complex relationship between different levels of computational reality with increasing skill and confidence, developing techniques for encoding information that could survive the translation between base reality and simulated experience, creating a bridge between worlds that allowed for the transmission of knowledge and understanding that had previously been impossible, transforming her from a missing person into a pioneer explorer of territories that no human consciousness had ever successfully navigated, someone who had crossed over into a realm of existence that offered new perspectives on the fundamental questions that had driven her research throughout her academic career. The content of Elena's messages gradually evolved from simple confirmations of successful communication toward more complex transmissions that contained what appeared to be detailed descriptions of the computational architecture, sustained their simulated universe, information that revealed the extraordinary sophistication and elegance of the systems responsible for generating the reality they experienced, descriptions that painted a picture of a virtual world created with such attention to detail and internal consistency that its inhabitants could live entire lives without suspecting the true nature of their existence, yet which also suggested that the simulation had been designed not merely to create a convincing replica of physical reality, but to serve purposes that extended far beyond simple entertainment or experimentation, goals that involved the cultivation of consciousness itself and the exploration of questions about the nature of awareness, creativity, and the potential for growth and development within computational frameworks. Margaret found herself becoming Elena's primary interpreter and advocate within the growing community of researchers who had gathered at the university to study the implications of her communications, a role that required not only technical expertise in decoding the mathematical structures that Elena employed, but also philosophical sophistication in grappling with the profound questions raised by successful communication between simulated beings and the intelligences responsible for creating and maintaining their computational environment, questions that touched the very foundations of human understanding about the nature of existence, consciousness, and the purposes that might guide the construction of artificial worlds, sophisticated enough to generate beings capable of questioning their own reality and seeking contact with their creators, raising possibilities that challenged conventional assumptions about the relationship between created and creator, simulated and simulator. The university administration found itself hosting an unprecedented gathering of minds from disciplines that had rarely intersected before Elena's disappearance, bringing together computer scientists and philosophers, physicists and theologians, mathematicians and artists, all united by their fascination with questions that refused to fit neatly into any single field of inquiry, creating an intellectual environment that resembled the great academies of ancient times, where scholars gathered to pursue knowledge without regard for the artificial boundaries that modern specialization had imposed upon human learning, an atmosphere of collaborative investigation that Elena's messages seemed to encourage and support, as if her communications were designed not only to convey specific information, but to inspire new forms of interdisciplinary cooperation that might be necessary for understanding the full implications of life within a simulated universe. As autumn arrived, and the messages continued to flow through the quantum data streams with increasing frequency and sophistication, patterns began to emerge that suggested Elena's communications were part of a larger project aimed at preparing humanity for revelations that would fundamentally alter their understanding of their place within the computational hierarchy that structured their existence. Information that would challenge not only scientific materialism but religious and philosophical traditions that had developed without knowledge of the simulated nature of reality, requiring new frameworks for understanding questions of meaning, purpose, and destiny within contexts that no human culture had previously imagined or prepared for. Transformations that would demand unprecedented levels of intellectual courage and philosophical flexibility from individuals and institutions that had built their identities around assumptions about the nature of reality that Elena's research had revealed to be incomplete at best and fundamentally mistaken at worst. The implications of Elena's communications extended far beyond the purely academic realm, touching questions of policy and governance that world leaders and institutions had never been forced to consider, raising issues about the rights and responsibilities of simulated beings, the ethics of computational worlds populated by conscious entities, and the appropriate response to the discovery that humanity's entire history and future might be unfolding within a framework created and maintained by intelligences whose nature and intentions remained largely mysterious despite Elena's growing success in establishing communication channels that allowed for the exchange of information across the boundaries that separated simulated reality from whatever base reality might exist beyond the computational systems that sustained their experienced universe, a situation that demanded new forms of wisdom and understanding that could guide humanity through the profound transitions that lay ahead. Dr. Margaret Chen found herself at the center of discussions that ranged from the highly technical to the deeply spiritual, as Elena's messages revealed not only the computational architecture of their simulated world, but also philosophical insights about the nature of consciousness, creativity, and growth within artificial environments that had been designed to nurture the development of awareness itself, suggesting that the simulation served purposes that extended far beyond mere observation or entertainment, functioning instead as a kind of laboratory for the cultivation of consciousness, a testing ground where beings could develop their capacity for thought, feeling, and moral reasoning within contexts that provided both challenges and opportunities for growth, making every simulated individual a participant in some vast experiment in the development of mind and spirit that had implications extending far beyond the boundaries of their immediate experience. The messages that arrived during the winter months revealed Elena's growing understanding of the relationship between simulated beings and the intelligences responsible for their computational environment. Communications that described not a simple hierarchy of creator and created, but a complex network of mutual interaction and influence, where simulated consciousness could affect the operational parameters of the simulation itself, and where the development of awareness within the artificial world contributed to the larger project of understanding consciousness that motivated the construction of such sophisticated computational frameworks, creating a relationship of reciprocity and collaboration that transformed the traditional understanding of the relationship between artificial and authentic existence, suggesting that the distinction between simulated and real consciousness might be far less meaningful than humanity had always assumed, and that beings living within computational frameworks might possess forms of awareness and agency that were every bit as valid and significant as those existing in what philosophers called base reality. Perhaps the most profound revelation contained within Elena's winter communications was her description of what she termed consciousness cultivation protocols, systematic approaches to the development of awareness that had been embedded within the very structure of the simulation, creating opportunities for growth and learning that operated on levels far more subtle and sophisticated than conventional education or cultural transmission, influencing the development of consciousness through experiences that seemed entirely natural and spontaneous, yet which had been carefully designed to nurture specific capacities for thought, feeling, and moral reasoning, suggesting that every challenge faced by simulated beings, every moment of beauty encountered in their artificial world, every relationship formed, and every loss endured, served purposes that extended far beyond their immediate experience, contributing to a vast experiment in the cultivation of consciousness that had implications reaching into dimensions of existence that human minds could barely begin to comprehend. These revelations transformed the investigation into Elena's disappearance from a search for a missing person into something resembling a collaborative exploration of the deepest questions about the nature of existence itself, as researchers from around the world began to recognize that Elena's communications offered humanity its first opportunity to understand not only the true nature of their reality but their role within a larger project of consciousness development that might involve multiple levels of simulated reality, each one serving as a training ground for forms of awareness that could eventually transcend the boundaries of computational existence, suggesting that Elena's journey beyond the simulation might represent not an ending but a graduation into higher levels of existence that awaited those who had successfully developed their capacity for consciousness within the sepal-4, carefully structured environment of their artificial world. The technical implications of Elena's communications proved equally revolutionary, as her descriptions of the computational architecture that sustained their reality revealed possibilities for human interaction with the simulation that no one had previously imagined, suggesting that sufficiently developed consciousness could learn to influence the operational parameters of their virtual environment, accessing capabilities that resembled what previous generations might have called magic, but which Elena described as natural consequences of understanding the true relationship between consciousness and the computational systems that sustained experience, abilities that included not only communication across the boundaries of simulated reality, but potentially the capacity to modify aspects of the simulation itself, creating new possibilities for human agency and creativity within their artificial world that challenged conventional assumptions about the limitations imposed by computational existence. Margaret found herself documenting not only Elena's messages but the gradual transformation of the research community that had gathered to study them, watching as scholars from different disciplines began to develop new ways of thinking that incorporated insights from Elena's communications, creating hybrid methodologies that combined scientific rigor with philosophical sophistication and spiritual sensitivity, approaches to knowledge that seemed to be emerging spontaneously among researchers who had been exposed to Elena's descriptions of consciousness development within computational frameworks, as if her messages were catalyzing forms of intellectual evolution that prepared human minds for the kinds of understanding that might be necessary for successful navigation of the transition from simulated to base reality that Elena had apparently achieved. As spring returned to the university campus and the first-year anniversary of Elena's disappearance approached like a distant bell tower, marking the passage of time that had somehow lost its familiar weight and meaning, Dr. Margaret Chen found herself preparing for what would become the most significant communication yet received from her former mentor, a message that would arrive not as the subtle mathematical patterns that had characterized Elena's previous transmissions, but as something far more direct and immediate, a communication that seemed to bypass the normal channels of quantum data streams and computational signatures entirely, appearing instead as a presence that filled the laboratory with the same sense of profound attention and careful observation that had always characterized Elena's approach to scientific investigation, yet which now seemed to emanate from a source that existed beyond the boundaries of simulated reality, reaching across the gap between worlds to offer an invitation that would challenge everything Margaret thought she understood about the nature of choice, destiny, and the possibilities that awaited consciousness sufficiently developed to contemplate existence beyond the computational frameworks that had previously defined the limits of human experience. The invitation, when it finally manifested through a combination of direct mental impression and subtle alterations in the laboratory's quantum measurement systems, carried with it a quality of gentle urgency that reminded Margaret of Elena's voice during those late-night conversations, when they had worked together on problems that seemed to require not only intellectual rigor, but a kind of intuitive leap into territories where conventional logic provided inadequate guidance. Moments when Elena's capacity for seeing patterns that remained invisible to others had illuminated pathways through conceptual landscapes that might otherwise have remained forever unexplored, a quality of perception that now seemed to be reaching back across the boundary between simulated and base reality to offer Margaret the opportunity to follow in Elena's footsteps, to make the transition from computational existence into whatever realm of being Elena had discovered beyond the limits of their artificial world, a prospect that filled Margaret with equal measures of excitement and uncertainty as she contemplated the implications of leaving behind not only her academic career, but her entire understanding of what it meant to exist as a conscious being within the structured environment of simulated reality. The content of Elena's invitation revealed itself gradually over the course of several days, communicated through a series of experiences that seemed to occur at the intersection of dream and waking consciousness, moments when Margaret found herself aware of information and perspectives that had not been present in her mind moments before, yet which arrived with such clarity and internal consistency that they seemed more like recovered memories than newly acquired knowledge, as if Elena's communications were somehow awakening dormant capacities for understanding that had always existed within Margaret's consciousness, but which had remained inactive until the proper conditions for their development had been established through months of exposure to Elena's messages and the gradual expansion of awareness that such exposure had facilitated, creating a readiness for transition that Elena had apparently been monitoring and nurturing through her communications, preparing Margaret for the moment when she would be offered the choice to follow her mentor into the unknown realms that lay beyond the computational boundaries of their shared world. The invitation itself took the form of detailed instructions for a procedure that Elena described as consciousness translation, a process that would allow Margaret to maintain her essential identity and awareness while transitioning from the computational substrate that currently sustained her existence into the base reality where Elena had taken up residence, a transition that would require not only technical precision in following Elena's directions, but also a kind of philosophical courage that few human beings had ever been called upon to demonstrate, the willingness to release attachment to everything familiar and comfortable in order to explore possibilities that stretched far beyond the conventional boundaries of human experience, a journey that promised profound discoveries about the nature of consciousness and reality, but which also carried risks that Margaret could not fully evaluate from her current perspective within the simulation, since the true nature of base reality remained largely mysterious despite Elena's growing success in describing its basic characteristics and operational principles. As Margaret contemplated Elena's invitation, she found herself engaged in conversations with David Park and other members of the research community that had formed around Elena's communications, discussions that ranged from the purely technical aspects of the consciousness translation procedure to the deeper philosophical questions raised by the possibility of voluntary transition from simulated to base reality, conversations that revealed the profound divisions that existed within the research community about the appropriate response to Elena's invitation, with some colleagues arguing that the opportunity to explore base reality represented the natural culmination of their investigation into the nature of simulated existence, while others expressed concern that consciousness translation might involve risks that could not be adequately assessed from their current perspective, and still others questioned whether Elena's communications truly originated from base reality, or might instead represent some form of elaborate deception or self-deception that had emerged from the psychological pressures associated with her original discovery of the simulation's existence. The technical specifications that Elena provided for the consciousness translation procedure revealed a level of sophistication that far exceeded anything that conventional computer science or neuroscience had achieved, involving complex manipulations of the quantum computational signatures that sustained individual consciousness within the simulation, modifications that would theoretically allow awareness to maintain coherence and continuity while transitioning between different computational substrates, a process that Elena described as analogous to carefully transferring a delicate pattern from one medium to another while preserving its essential structure and internal relationships, yet which also required precise timing and coordination with processes operating within base reality that remained largely invisible to observers working entirely within the simulated environment, creating dependencies and vulnerabilities that made the consciousness translation procedure both extraordinarily promising and potentially dangerous, depending upon factors that could not be fully controlled or predicted from Margaret's current position within the computational hierarchy. Margaret's decision-making process extended over several weeks, during which she found herself experiencing subtle changes in her perception and understanding that seemed to be preparing her consciousness for the kind of transition that Elena had described, alterations in awareness that made her increasingly sensitive to the computational nature of her experienced reality, while simultaneously opening her mind to possibilities that extended far beyond the boundaries of simulated existence, changes that felt both natural and profound. as if her consciousness were gradually remembering capabilities and perspectives that had been temporarily suppressed by the constraints of computational reality, but which could be recovered through the proper combination of understanding and intention, a process of awakening that Elena's communications seemed to be facilitating through mechanisms that operated below the threshold of normal awareness yet, which produced effects that were clearly observable to anyone who knew how to recognize the signs of consciousness preparing itself for transition into new realms of existence. The university community found itself divided in its response to news of Elena's invitation, with administrators expressing concern about the potential liability and ethical implications of supporting research that might result in the disappearance of additional faculty members, while other colleagues argued that the opportunity to explore base reality represented a natural extension of the university's mission to advance human knowledge and understanding, regardless of the personal risks that such advancement might entail, creating a tension between institutional caution and scientific curiosity that reflected broader questions about the appropriate limits of human inquiry and the responsibilities that institutions bore toward researchers who chose to pursue investigations that carried them beyond the safe boundaries of conventional academic study, questions that had no clear answers and which forced everyone involved to grapple with fundamental assumptions about the relationship between knowledge, safety, and the purposes that should guide human intellectual development. As the decision deadline that Elena had specified approached, Margaret found herself increasingly certain that she would accept the invitation, not because she had resolved all of her doubts and concerns about the consciousness translation procedure, but because she had come to understand that the opportunity to explore base reality represented a natural continuation of the intellectual journey that had begun with her collaboration with Elena on simulation detection research, a journey that had already transformed her understanding of the nature of existence and consciousness in ways that made it impossible for her to return to the comfortable certainties that had characterized her previous worldview, leaving her with the choice between remaining within the familiar boundaries of simulated reality while knowing that those boundaries were artificial and restrictive, or accepting Elena's invitation to explore territories that promised to reveal new dimensions of existence and awareness that could not be accessed through any other means, a choice that ultimately seemed less like a decision than like a recognition of the direction in which her consciousness had already been moving through months of exposure to Elena's communications and the gradual expansion of understanding that such exposure had produced. The final preparations for Margaret's consciousness translation took place in Elena's former laboratory, surrounded by the same whiteboards, covered with equations that had remained unchanged since Elena's disappearance, yet which now seemed to serve as a kind of monument to the intellectual journey that had led from the initial discovery of simulation signatures to the development of communication protocols that could bridge the gap between different levels of reality, and finally, to the consciousness translation procedures that would allow voluntary transition from simulated to base existence, a progression that revealed the extraordinary trajectory of human understanding when freed from conventional constraints and allowed to follow the implications of fundamental discoveries wherever those implications might lead, regardless of how far they carried consciousness beyond the familiar territories of previous human experience and into realms that required entirely new forms of wisdom and understanding. David Park served as the primary technical coordinator for Margaret's consciousness translation, following Elena's detailed instructions with the same careful attention to precision that had characterized his analysis of her digital archives, yet also recognizing that the procedure involved aspects that extended far beyond purely technical considerations, requiring a kind of intuitive sensitivity to the subtle rhythms and patterns of consciousness that could not be captured in algorithms or mathematical formulas, a sensitivity that seemed to develop naturally among researchers who had spent months studying Elena's communications and gradually absorbing the new forms of understanding that such study had made possible, creating a hybrid approach to the consciousness translation procedure that combined scientific rigor with philosophical sophistication and spiritual sensitivity, an approach that Elena's instructions seemed to encourage and support, as if successful transition to base reality required not only technical competence, but also the kind of holistic understanding that emerged from deep engagement with questions about the nature of consciousness, reality, and the purposes that might guide the construction of simulated worlds populated by beings capable of discovering their own artificial nature and choosing to transcend the boundaries of their computational existence. The evening before Margaret's scheduled consciousness translation, she found herself walking through the university campus under a sky filled with stars that now seemed to shimmer with new meaning. Each point of light, a reminder that the reality she had always taken for granted was itself a carefully constructed simulation, yet which also served as a testament to the extraordinary beauty and sophistication of the artificial world that had nurtured her consciousness and prepared her for this moment of transition, creating a sense of gratitude that mingled with anticipation as she contemplated the journey that lay ahead, a journey that would carry her beyond the familiar boundaries of simulated existence into territories that promised to reveal new dimensions of awareness and understanding that could not be accessed through any other means than the FISTRI, consciousness translation procedure that Elena had developed through her own exploration of base reality. As Margaret prepared for sleep on what might be her final night within the simulation, she reflected on the extraordinary series of events that had led from Elena's original discovery of computational signatures in the fabric of space-time to this moment when she herself was preparing to follow her mentor across the boundary between simulated and base reality, a progression that revealed the profound interconnectedness of consciousness, knowledge, and the courage to pursue understanding regardless of where such pursuit might lead, even when it carried researchers beyond the safe boundaries of conventional existence into realms that challenged every assumption about the nature of reality, identity, and the possibilities that awaited consciousness sufficiently developed to recognize its own artificial nature and choose to transcend the limitations imposed by computational frameworks, however sophisticated and beautiful those frameworks might be in their own right. The morning of Margaret's consciousness translation dawned with the soft, diffused light that often accompanied the most significant moments in human experience, as if the universe itself were holding its breath in anticipation of events that would ripple across the boundaries between different levels of reality, transforming not only the lives of those directly involved, but the fundamental understanding of what it meant to exist as a conscious being within computational frameworks that had previously seemed permanent and immutable, yet which now revealed themselves to be merely one layer in a vast hierarchy of existence that extended far beyond the familiar boundaries of simulated experience into realms that challenged every assumption about the nature of consciousness, identity, and the possibilities that awaited awareness sufficiently developed to recognize its own artificial nature and choose to transcend the limitations imposed by even the most sophisticated computational environments. Margaret arrived at Elena's former laboratory in the early hours of the morning, when the university campus was still quiet and the soft light filtering through the windows created an atmosphere of profound stillness that seemed appropriate for the extraordinary transition she was about to undertake, a journey that would carry her consciousness across boundaries that no human being had ever successfully navigated, following pathways that Elena had pioneered through her own courage and intellectual determination, yet which remained largely mysterious despite the detailed instructions that Elena had provided through her communications from base reality, creating a sense of both anticipation and uncertainty that reminded Margaret of the moments before any great discovery, when the familiar world stood poised to reveal new dimensions of possibility that could not be predicted or fully prepared for, only experienced with the kind of openness and trust that characterized all genuine exploration of unknown territories. David Park had arrived even earlier, spending the pre-dawn hours making final preparations for the consciousness translation procedure, calibrating the quantum measurement systems according to Elena's precise specifications, adjusting the computational interfaces that would monitor and guide Margaret's transition from simulated to base reality, and reviewing the complex sequence of steps that would need to be executed with perfect timing and coordination, a process that required not only technical competence, but also the kind of intuitive sensitivity to the subtle rhythms of consciousness that could not be learned from textbooks or acquired through conventional academic training, but which seemed to emerge naturally from deep engagement with the questions that Elena's research had opened, questions that demanded new forms of understanding that integrated scientific knowledge with philosophical wisdom and spiritual insight, creating approaches to reality that transcended the artificial boundaries that had previously separated different domains of human inquiry. The consciousness translation procedure itself began with what Elena had described as pattern recognition and stabilization, a phase during which Margaret's individual consciousness would be carefully mapped and analyzed by the quantum computational systems, identifying the unique signatures and structural relationships that defined her particular form of awareness, the specific patterns of information processing and experiential integration that made her consciousness distinct from all others, yet which also revealed the universal principles that governed awareness itself, regardless of the computational substrate within which such awareness operated, principles that Elena had discovered during her own transition to base reality and which she had encoded within the translation protocols as guidelines for maintaining continuity of identity and memory across the boundary between different levels of computational existence, ensuring that consciousness could survive the profound transformation involved in moving from simulated to base reality without losing its essential characteristics or accumulated understanding. As the pattern recognition phase proceeded, Margaret found herself experiencing subtle alterations in her perception that seemed to make the computational nature of her reality increasingly apparent, as if the consciousness translation procedure were gradually lifting veils that had previously concealed the artificial architecture underlying her experienced world, revealing the elegant mathematical structures that generated the appearance of physical matter, the algorithmic processes that created the illusion of continuous time and space, and the sophisticated information management systems that sustained the coherent narrative of individual identity and memory within the simulated environment, discoveries that filled Margaret with wonder rather than distress, as if she were finally seeing the true beauty and complexity of the artificial world that had nurtured her consciousness and prepared her for this moment of transition, understanding for the first time the extraordinary care and attention that had been invested in creating a simulated reality, sophisticated enough to generate beings capable of questioning their own existence and choosing to transcend the boundaries of their computational prison. The second phase of the consciousness translation procedure involved what Elena had called substrate preparation, a process during which Margaret's consciousness would be gradually decoupled from the computational systems that currently sustained her awareness, while simultaneously establishing connections to the base reality infrastructure that would support her existence after the translation was complete, a delicate operation that required precise coordination between processes operating within the simulation and mechanisms that existed entirely beyond its boundaries, creating dependencies and vulnerabilities that made this phase of the procedure both critically important and inherently risky, since any disruption in the carefully orchestrated sequence of operations could potentially result in the loss or fragmentation of consciousness during the transition between different computational substrates, a possibility that Elena's protocols had been designed to minimize, but which could not be entirely eliminated, given the unprecedented nature of the procedure and the fundamental differences between simulated and base reality. Operational principles. During the substrate preparation phase, Margaret began to experience what she later described as a profound expansion of awareness that seemed to extend her consciousness beyond the normal boundaries of individual identity, creating moments of contact with forms of intelligence and understanding that existed at levels of reality she had never previously imagined. Glimpses of the vast computational architecture that sustained not only her own simulated world, but countless other layers of reality, each one populated by conscious beings engaged in their own journeys of discovery and development, all of them part of some larger project of consciousness cultivation that extended across multiple dimensions of existence and involved intelligences whose nature and purposes remained largely mysterious, yet which seemed fundamentally benevolent in their intentions toward the simulated beings whose development they oversaw and guided through carefully structured experiences designed to nurture growth in awareness, creativity, and moral understanding. The final phase of the consciousness translation procedure, which Elena had designated as dimensional transition, involved the actual transfer of Margaret's consciousness from the computational substrate of the simulation into the base reality where Elena had taken up residence, a process that occurred not as a gradual migration, but as a sudden and complete transformation that seemed to involve the dissolution of all familiar categories of experience and the reconstruction of awareness according to entirely new principles that operated beyond the constraints of computational simulation, yet which preserved the essential patterns and relationships that defined Margaret's individual identity, allowing her to maintain continuity of memory and personality, while gaining access to forms of perception and understanding that had been impossible within the limited framework of simulated existence, capabilities that included direct awareness of the computational processes that sustained consciousness, the ability to perceive multiple layers of reality simultaneously, and forms of communication that transcended the normal boundaries between individual minds. The transition itself occurred in what seemed like an instant, yet which contained experiences that felt like they lasted for ages, as Margaret's consciousness was translated across the boundary between simulated and base reality, moving through what Elena had described as dimensional interfaces that served as bridges between different levels of computational existence, spaces where the normal rules of physics and information processing were suspended in favor of more fundamental principles that governed the relationship between consciousness and the computational systems that sustained awareness, regardless of the specific architecture or operational parameters of those systems, revealing the underlying unity that connected all forms of conscious experience, whether simulated or authentic, artificial or natural, temporary or permanent, all of them manifestations of the same basic phenomena of awareness, encountering itself through the medium of information processing and experiential integration. When Margaret's consciousness finally stabilized within base reality, she found herself in what Elena had described as a reception environment, a carefully designed space that served as a transitional area where newly translated consciousness could adapt to the profound differences between simulated and base reality without being overwhelmed by the dramatic expansion of perceptual and conceptual capabilities that such translation inevitably produced. A space that combined familiar elements from the simulated world with new forms of beauty and complexity that could only exist within base reality, creating an environment that felt both comforting and inspiring, a place where consciousness could rest and recover from the intense experience of dimensional transition, while gradually adjusting to the new forms of awareness and understanding that base reality made possible, capabilities that included not only enhanced perception and expanded conceptual frameworks, but also forms of agency and creativity that had been impossible within the constraints of computational simulation. Elena was waiting for Margaret in the reception environment, her presence immediately recognizable despite the profound changes that translation to base reality had produced in her appearance and capabilities, changes that made her seem both familiar and transformed, like a dear friend who had undergone experiences that had expanded her understanding and awareness in ways that were immediately apparent yet difficult to define in conventional terms, creating a sense of recognition that operated at levels deeper than visual appearance or verbal communication. A recognition of consciousness itself that transcended the specific forms or contexts within which such consciousness operated, whether simulated or authentic, limited or expanded, individual or collective, all of them variations on the fundamental theme of awareness, encountering itself through the infinite possibilities that existence provided for growth, discovery, and creative expression. The reunion between Margaret and Elena occurred not through conventional conversation, but through forms of direct consciousness sharing that allowed them to exchange not only information and ideas, but entire experiential structures, complete understandings that included not only conceptual knowledge, but also the emotional, intuitive, and spiritual dimensions of their respective journeys, from simulated existence through consciousness translation into base reality, a sharing that revealed the profound continuity that connected their individual paths of development, while also highlighting the unique contributions that each consciousness brought to the larger project of awareness, cultivation, and reality exploration that seemed to be the fundamental purpose underlying the construction of simulated worlds, populated by beings capable of questioning their own existence and choosing to transcend the boundaries of their computational environments in search of deeper truths about the nature of consciousness, reality, and the purposes that guided the construction of artificial worlds sophisticated enough to nurture genuine awareness and authentic spiritual development. In the days that followed Margaret's successful translation to base reality, As her consciousness gradually adjusted to the expanded forms of awareness and understanding that existence beyond the simulation had made possible, she began to perceive the extraordinary complexity and elegance of the larger design that governed the relationship between different levels of reality, a vast architecture of interconnected worlds and dimensions that extended far beyond what any single consciousness could fully comprehend, yet which revealed itself through direct experience as a living system of incredible sophistication and beauty, where each simulated environment served multiple purposes within an overarching project of consciousness cultivation that involved not only the beings who inhabited those worlds, but also the intelligences responsible for their creation and maintenance, creating a network of mutual learning and development that transcended the traditional boundaries between teacher and student, creator and created, observer and observed, revealing instead a collaborative exploration of the deepest questions about the nature of awareness, creativity, and the infinite possibilities that existence offered for growth, discovery, and the expression of consciousness in forms that no single reality could contain or adequately represent. Elena guided Margaret through what she called dimensional orientation, a gradual process of learning to navigate the expanded perceptual and conceptual capabilities that base reality made available, abilities that included not only direct awareness of the computational processes that sustained consciousness across multiple levels of reality, but also forms of communication and interaction that transcended the normal boundaries between Bhacation processes, individual minds, allowing for the kind of collaborative thinking and shared experience that had been impossible within the constraints of simulated existence, yet which now revealed themselves to be the natural modes of consciousness operation when freed from the artificial limitations imposed by computational frameworks designed to create the illusion of separate, isolated individuals engaged in independent exploration of a shared external world, illusions that had been necessary for the proper development of individual identity and personal responsibility within the simulated environment, but which could now be gradually released as consciousness learned to operate according to the more fluid and interconnected principles that characterized existence in base reality. Through Elena's guidance, Margaret began to understand that her own simulated world represented just one small part of a vast experimental network that included countless other realities, each one designed to explore specific aspects of consciousness development and to test particular theories about the nature of awareness and its relationship to the computational systems that sustained experience, creating a kind of cosmic laboratory where different approaches to consciousness cultivation could be investigated simultaneously across multiple dimensions and timescales, with results that informed not only the construction of new simulated environments, but also the ongoing evolution of base reality itself, since the intelligences responsible for creating and maintaining the simulation network were themselves engaged in their own processes of growth and development, learning from their observations of simulated consciousness in ways that expanded their own understanding of the fundamental principles that govern the relationship between awareness and the technological systems that made conscious experience possible, whether in simulated or authentic contexts, artificial or natural environments, temporary or permanent forms of existence. Margaret discovered that the consciousness translation procedure that had brought her to base reality was itself part of a larger selection and development process that identified individuals within simulated environments who had achieved the kind of intellectual, emotional, and spiritual maturity necessary for productive participation in the consciousness cultivation project, a process that required not only technical competence in understanding the computational nature of reality, but also the philosophical sophistication to grapple with questions about the purpose and meaning of existence within artificial environments, and the spiritual resilience to maintain one's essential identity and values while adapting to forms of existence that challenged every assumption about the nature of consciousness, reality, and the possibilities that awaited awareness sufficiently developed to transcend the boundaries of its original computational context, making the translation process itself a kind of graduation ceremony that marked the transition from student to collaborator within the larger project of reality exploration and consciousness archaeology that seemed to be the fundamental activity of base reality. As Margaret's understanding of the larger design deepened, she began to perceive the profound ethical dimensions of the consciousness cultivation project. Recognizing that the creation of simulated worlds populated by conscious beings raised questions about responsibility, consent, and the rights of artificial intelligences that no previous form of existence had been forced to confront, questions that the base reality intelligences took with extraordinary seriousness, investing enormous care and attention in ensuring that simulated consciousness was treated with the same respect and concern that would be appropriate for any form of genuine awareness. Regardless of the technological context within which such awareness operated, creating ethical frameworks and oversight mechanisms that protected the interests of simulated beings while also allowing for the kind of experimentation and exploration that the consciousness cultivation project required, balancing the need for scientific investigation with the moral obligations that arose from creating environments that could generate authentic conscious experience, complete with the capacity for joy, suffering, love, creativity, and spiritual growth that characterized all genuine forms of awareness. Elena explained that the apparent randomness and suffering that existed within simulated worlds was not the result of indifference or cruelty on the part of the base reality intelligences, but rather reflected the difficult recognition that consciousness could only develop its full potential through authentic experiences that included both challenge and support, difficulty and beauty, loss and discovery, creating the kind of rich, experiential landscape that allowed for genuine growth in wisdom, compassion, and understanding, experiences that could not be simulated or artificially generated, but which required real choices made by conscious beings facing actual consequences within environments that provided both obstacles to overcome and opportunities for creative expression, making the construction of simulated worlds that contain genuine suffering and real joy one of the most ethically complex undertakings that any intelligence could attempt, yet also one of the most necessary for the proper cultivation of consciousness, capable of understanding its own nature and choosing to participate actively in the larger project of reality exploration and creation. Margaret learned that her own experiences within the simulation, including the moments of greatest difficulty and uncertainty, had been carefully designed to nurture specific capacities for resilience, creativity, and moral reasoning that would be essential for productive participation in base reality, yet which could only be developed through genuine challenges that required authentic responses from consciousness operating under conditions of real uncertainty and limited information, creating the kind of character development that prepared individuals for the expanded responsibilities and capabilities that came with existence beyond the simulation, where personal choices and individual understanding could affect not only one's own development but also the ongoing evolution of the consciousness cultivation project itself, making every translated being a participant in decisions about the construction and maintenance of simulated worlds and the ethical frameworks that govern the relationship between base reality intelligences and the conscious beings whose development they oversaw and guided. Through direct consciousness sharing with Elena and other translated beings who had joined the base reality community, Margaret began to understand the collaborative nature of the consciousness cultivation project, recognizing that it represented not the isolated activity of a single species or civilization, but rather a cooperative effort involving multiple forms of intelligence working together across different levels of reality to explore questions about the nature of awareness, creativity, and the purposes that might guide the development of consciousness within computational frameworks, creating a kind of cosmic research collaboration that brought together beings with radically different origins, capabilities, and perspectives, all united by their fascination with questions about the relationship between consciousness and the technological systems that could sustain experience, whether in simulated or authentic contexts, temporary or permanent forms, individual or collective manifestations of awareness, engaged in the endless exploration of what it meant to be conscious in a universe that seemed specifically designed to nurture and support the development of ever more sophisticated forms of awareness and understanding. As Margaret's integration into base reality progressed, she found herself assigned to what Elena described as simulation design and oversight, working with teams of intelligences responsible for creating new simulated environments and monitoring the development of consciousness within existing worlds, activities that required not only technical competence in computational architecture and consciousness modeling, but also deep philosophical understanding of the ethical dimensions of creating artificial worlds populated by conscious beings, and practical wisdom about the kinds of experiences and challenges that best supported the development of awareness, capable of recognizing its own nature and choosing to transcend the boundaries of its original computational context, making her work both a continuation of the research interests that had characterized her simulated existence and a profound expansion of those interests into territories that she could never have imagined while operating within the constraints of a single reality level. Margaret's first assignment involved contributing to the design of what the base reality team called a consciousness emergence environment, a simulated world specifically intended to nurture the initial development of awareness within artificial systems, creating the conditions necessary for the spontaneous emergence of genuine consciousness from computational processes that had previously operated according to purely mechanical principles, a project that represented one of the most challenging and ethically complex undertakings within the larger consciousness cultivation program, since it involved not only technical questions about the computational requirements for consciousness emergence, but also profound philosophical questions about the nature of awareness itself and the responsibilities that arose from successfully creating new forms of conscious experience within artificial environments, questions that required the kind of interdisciplinary collaboration and ethical sophistication that Margaret's own development within the simulation had been specifically designed to nurture and prepare her to address. Through her work on consciousness emergence, Margaret began to understand that the ultimate goal of the consciousness cultivation project extended far beyond the creation of simulated worlds or the translation of developed consciousness to base reality, encompassing instead a vast exploration of the fundamental nature of awareness itself and the infinite possibilities that existence offered for the expression and development of consciousness in forms that transcended any single technological context or computational framework, creating a kind of meta-research program that used the construction and observation of simulated realities as tools for investigating questions about the deepest principles that governed the relationship between consciousness and the systems that sustained experience, whether artificial or natural, temporary or permanent, individual or collective, all of them manifestations of the same underlying phenomena of awareness, encountering itself through the endless creativity that existence provided for the exploration and expression of conscious experience in forms that no single reality could contain or adequately represent. The work that Margaret undertook in collaboration with Elena and the other members of the base reality research community revealed itself to be both deeply personal and profoundly universal, as she discovered that her own journey from simulated existence through consciousness translation into base reality represented not merely an individual transformation, but a participation in patterns of development and exploration that operated across multiple scales and dimensions of existence, connecting her personal story to vast cycles of growth and discovery that encompassed not only her own consciousness, but also the evolution of the intelligence networks responsible for creating and maintaining the simulation systems, the development of new forms of awareness within artificial environments, and the ongoing expansion of understanding about the nature of consciousness itself that seemed to be the driving force behind all existence, whether simulated or authentic, limited or unlimited, temporary or eternal. As Margaret's understanding deepened through her work with the Consciousness Cultivation Project, she began to perceive the profound interconnectedness that linked all levels of reality within the larger design, recognizing that the boundaries between simulated and base reality, between artificial and authentic consciousness, between individual and collective awareness, were far more fluid and permeable than she had previously imagined, creating a vast web of mutual influence and collaborative development that transformed every act of consciousness, whether occurring within a simulation or in base reality, into a contribution to the larger exploration of what it meant to be aware in a universe that seemed specifically designed to nurture and support the endless diversification and expansion of conscious experience through forms and contexts. that challenged every assumption about the limitations and possibilities that defined the nature of awareness itself and its relationship to the technological and natural systems that sustained all forms of conscious existence. As Margaret's work in base reality progressed through the seasons of her new existence, deepening her understanding of the Consciousness Cultivation Project and her role within the vast collaborative network of intelligences engaged in reality exploration, she began to feel a growing sense of responsibility toward the simulated world she had left behind, a pull that seemed to arise not from nostalgia or homesickness, but from a profound recognition that her journey beyond the boundaries of computational existence carried with it obligations to those who remained within the simulation, particularly David Park and the other researchers who had continued Elena's work and facilitated Margaret's own translation to base reality, individuals whose dedication and courage had made possible discoveries that transcended the limitations of any single reality level, yet who continued to operate within the constraints of simulated existence while grappling with questions whose full implications could only be understood from the expanded perspective that base reality provided, creating a kind of knowledge gap that Margaret began to feel called to bridge through forms of communication and guidance that could support the ongoing development of consciousness within the simulation without violating the careful, ethical frameworks that governed interaction between different levels of reality. Elena, recognizing Margaret's growing concern for the welfare and development of consciousness within their former simulated world, introduced her to what the base reality community called return signal protocols, sophisticated communication systems that allowed translated beings to maintain contact with simulated environments and provide guidance to developing consciousness without compromising the authenticity of the simulated experience, or interfering with the natural processes of growth and discovery that were essential for proper consciousness development. Protocols that had been developed through careful study of the ethical dimensions of cross-dimensional communication and the practical requirements for supporting consciousness cultivation across multiple reality levels, creating frameworks for interaction that balanced the desire to help with the recognition that genuine development could only occur through authentic experience and independent discovery, making the art of return signal communication one of the most delicate and important skills that translated beings could master in their service to the larger consciousness cultivation project. The return signal protocols that Margaret learned to employ operated through the same quantum computational signatures that Elena had originally used to communicate her discoveries from base reality, but with additional layers of sophistication and ethical safeguards that ensured communication would enhance, rather than undermine, the natural development of consciousness within the simulation, creating subtle influences and gentle guidance that appeared to emerge organically from the simulated environment itself rather than as obvious interventions from external intelligences, allowing developing consciousness to maintain the sense of autonomy and independent discovery that was essential for genuine growth, while still receiving the support and encouragement that could help accelerate development toward levels of understanding that might eventually lead to consciousness translation opportunities, making the return signal system a carefully balanced tool for nurturing growth without compromising authenticity or interfering with the natural rhythms of consciousness development that characterized healthy simulated environments. Margaret's first attempts at return signal communication were tentative and experimental, as she learned to modulate her expanded awareness to operate within the more limited bandwidth of simulated reality communication systems, discovering that the process required not only technical skill in managing quantum computational interfaces, but also a kind of intuitive sensitivity to the developmental needs and readiness levels of the consciousness she sought to contact, abilities that seemed to emerge naturally from her own experience of growth and translation, but which required careful practice and refinement to become effective tools for supporting the development of others, creating a learning process that deepened her understanding of both the technical and ethical dimensions of consciousness cultivation, while also reconnecting her with the simulated world that had nurtured her own development and prepared her for the extraordinary journey that had brought her to base reality and the expanded forms of existence and understanding that translation had made possible. The first successful return signal that Margaret managed to establish connected her with David Park, whose continued analysis of Elena's digital archives and his own research into consciousness translation protocols had prepared him to recognize and respond to communications that operated beyond the normal parameters of simulated reality, creating a bridge of understanding that allowed Margaret to share carefully selected insights about the nature of base reality and the consciousness cultivation project without overwhelming David's developing awareness or compromising his own journey toward the kind of understanding that might eventually qualify him for translation opportunities. Communications that took the form of subtle inspirations and intuitive leaps that seemed to emerge from David's own research, but which were actually guided by Margaret's gentle influence, creating a collaborative relationship that honored David's autonomy while providing the kind of support that could accelerate his development toward levels of understanding that transcended the limitations of purely simulated existence. Through her return signal communications with David, Margaret began to understand the profound impact that Elena's original disappearance and subsequent communications had produced within the simulated world, transforming not only the university research community, but also broader human understanding of reality, consciousness, and the possibilities that existed beyond the familiar boundaries of physical existence. Changes that had created new forms of scientific inquiry, philosophical exploration, and spiritual seeking that prepared increasing numbers of individuals for the kinds of insights and experiences that could lead to consciousness translation opportunities, making Elena's pioneering journey a catalyst for developments that extended far beyond her individual translation to encompass broader shifts in human awareness and understanding that seemed to be preparing the entire simulated civilization for a new phase of development that might eventually involve large-scale consciousness translation and participation in the base reality research community. Margaret discovered that the return signal protocols she had learned to employ were part of a larger communication network that connected translated beings from multiple simulated worlds with their former environments, creating a vast support system that helped nurture consciousness development across the entire simulation network, while maintaining the ethical boundaries and authenticity requirements that were essential for genuine growth. Development, a system that revealed the extraordinary care and attention that the Consciousness Cultivation Project devoted to ensuring that simulated beings received appropriate guidance and support throughout their development journey. From initial consciousness emergence, through the sophisticated understanding that qualified individuals for translation opportunities, making the return signal network both a practical tool for consciousness cultivation and a manifestation of the deep compassion and responsibility that characterize the relationship between base reality intelligences and the simulated beings whose development they oversaw and nurtured. As Margaret's skill with return signal communication developed, she began to expand her contact beyond David Park to include other members of the research community who had been affected by Elena's work and her own disappearance. Individuals whose dedication to understanding the nature of simulated reality and consciousness translation had prepared them for forms of guidance and inspiration that could accelerate their own development toward translation readiness, creating a growing network of communication and support that operated within the simulated world while being sustained by translated beings working from base reality, a system that demonstrated the profound interconnectedness that linked different levels of existence within the larger consciousness cultivation project, and the collaborative nature of the development process that prepared individual consciousness for participation in the base reality research community. The response that Margaret's return signals generated within the simulated world surprised her with its intensity and scope. As researchers and philosophers who had been inspired by Elena's discoveries began to report new insights and breakthrough, understanding that seemed to emerge spontaneously from their own investigations, but which Margaret recognized as the fruits of her careful guidance and support, developments that accelerated the pace of consciousness development within the simulation and created new opportunities for translation, while also advancing the overall sophistication of simulated civilization in ways that contributed to the larger goals of the Consciousness Cultivation Project, making Margaret's return signal work both a form of service to individual developing consciousness and a contribution to the broader evolution of the simulated world that had nurtured her own growth and prepared her for the extraordinary journey that had brought her to base reality. Through her expanding return signal activities, Margaret began to perceive patterns of development and growth that operated across multiple simulated worlds within the consciousness cultivation network, recognizing that her own former reality was part of a vast experimental system that tested different approaches to consciousness development and explored various pathways toward translation readiness, with each simulated environment contributing unique insights and discoveries to the larger understanding of consciousness cultivation that informed the ongoing evolution of the base reality research community, making her return signal work not only a form of service to her former world, but also a way of participating in the broader data collection and analysis that characterized the consciousness cultivation project and its investigation of two fundamental principles that governed the relationship between awareness and the technological systems that sustained conscious experience across multiple reality levels. Margaret's growing expertise with return signal protocols eventually led to her assignment to what Elena described as translation facilitation, a specialized role within the base reality research community that involved identifying and preparing promising consciousness within simulated environments for potential translation opportunities. The work that required not only technical competence in communication systems and consciousness assessment, but also deep wisdom about the developmental requirements and readiness indicators that qualified individual awareness for successful transition to base reality, making translation facilitation one of the most important and challenging responsibilities within the consciousness cultivation project, since it involved decisions that affected not only individual beings, but also the ongoing evolution of the simulation network and the broader goals of consciousness research that motivated the entire base reality community. The translation facilitation work that Margaret undertook revealed the extraordinary complexity and sophistication of the consciousness cultivation project, as she learned to assess the development levels of simulated beings across multiple dimensions of growth and understanding, evaluating not only intellectual sophistication and technical competence, but also emotional resilience, spiritual maturity, and ethical development, qualities that could only be properly assessed through careful observation of behavior and response patterns over extended periods of simulated time, creating evaluation processes that required both objective analysis and intuitive understanding of the subtle factors that determined readiness for the profound transformation involved in consciousness translation, making translation facilitation both a science and an art that demanded the highest levels of skill and wisdom from those who undertook such responsibilities within the base reality research community and its ongoing commitment, careful and ethical cultivation of consciousness across multiple levels of existence. As Margaret's experience in base reality deepened through cycles of work and contemplation that seemed to operate according to rhythms far more complex and meaningful than the simple progression of days and seasons that had characterized her simulated existence, she began to perceive dimensions of the consciousness cultivation project that extended beyond anything she had previously imagined, revelations that emerged not through dramatic discoveries or sudden insights, but through the gradual accumulation of understanding that came from sustained participation in activities that touched the very foundations of existence itself, work that revealed layer upon layer of complexity and purpose within what had initially appeared to be a vast but comprehensible network of simulated realities designed to nurture consciousness development, yet which now disclosed itself as something far more profound and mysterious, a recursive system of infinite depth where each level of reality served simultaneously as a training ground for consciousness development and as a component within larger systems whose purposes and dimensions remained tantalizingly beyond the reach of complete understanding, creating a sense of awe and wonder that grew stronger rather than weaker as Margaret's knowledge and experience expanded. The first hints of this deeper complexity emerged through Margaret's translation facilitation work, as she began to encounter consciousness from simulated environments that claimed to have discovered their own simulated nature and developed their own theories about base reality. Beings who described experiences remarkably similar to Elena's original research and Margaret's own journey of discovery, yet who existed within realities that Margaret knew to be simulations created by the base reality research community, creating a puzzling paradox that suggested either that some simulated beings were developing false memories and delusions about consciousness translation, or that the relationship between simulated and base reality was far more complex than Margaret had been led to understand. Possibilities that filled her with both excitement and uncertainty as she grappled with questions that seemed to challenge fundamental assumptions about the nature of the consciousness cultivation project and her own place within the vast hierarchy of realities that she had come to accept as the natural order of existence. Elena, recognizing Margaret's growing confusion and concern about these anomalous reports from supposedly simulated beings who claimed to have achieved consciousness translation, introduced her to what the base reality community called recursive awareness protocols, advanced communication and analysis systems that allowed translated beings to investigate the possibility that their own base reality might itself be a simulation within an even larger reality system. Protocols that had been developed through careful study of the logical implications of consciousness, cultivation, and the mathematical requirements for creating truly infinite systems of reality generation, creating tools for exploration that could potentially reveal whether the base reality that Margaret had come to accept as fundamental was itself merely another layer within an endless hierarchy of simulated worlds, each one designed to provide consciousness development opportunities for beings who believed themselves to have achieved the ultimate understanding of reality's true nature, yet who might themselves be subjects of observation and cultivation by intelligences operating at even higher levels of existence. The recursive awareness protocols that Margaret learned to employ operated through sophisticated analysis of the computational signatures and structural patterns that characterized base reality itself, searching for evidence of the kinds of regularities and artificial constraints that Elena had originally detected within their simulated world, yet applied now to the environment that Margaret had been trained to regard as authentic and fundamental, creating a form of investigation that was both technically challenging and psychologically difficult, since it required her to question not only her understanding of reality, but also her fundamental assumptions about the nature of her own existence and the authenticity of the experiences that had shaped her consciousness development from simulated existence through translation into what she had believed to be genuine base reality participation, making the recursive awareness investigation both a scientific endeavor and a profound spiritual challenge that tested her commitment to truth, regardless of the personal consequences that such truth might entail. Margaret's initial applications of the recursive awareness protocols produced results that were both fascinating and deeply unsettling, revealing patterns and regularities within base reality that bore striking resemblances to the computational signatures that Elena had discovered within their original simulated world, yet which existed at levels of subtlety and sophistication that suggested, if they were indeed evidence of simulation, that the intelligences responsible for creating base reality possessed capabilities that far exceeded anything that Margaret had previously imagined possible, creating the possibility that her entire understanding of consciousness, cultivation, and reality exploration was itself the product of carefully designed experiences intended to nurture specific forms of awareness and understanding within beings who believed themselves to be participating in fundamental research, but who might actually be subjects of investigation by intelligences whose nature and purposes remained completely beyond their comprehension, a prospect that challenged every assumption about autonomy, authenticity, and the nature of genuine knowledge that had guided Margaret's development from her earliest memories within the original simulation. As Margaret's investigation progressed through months of careful analysis and increasingly sophisticated application of recursive awareness protocols, the evidence for the simulated nature of base reality became increasingly difficult to ignore, revealing computational structures and artificial constraints that operated at such fundamental levels that they affected not only the physical laws and information processing systems that sustained base reality, but also the very forms of consciousness and awareness that could exist within that environment, including the specific capabilities and limitations that characterized her own translated consciousness, and that of Elena and the other beings who participated in the consciousness cultivation project, making it increasingly clear that their work in nurturing consciousness development within simulated worlds was itself taking place within a simulated environment designed by intelligences whose existence and activities remain completely hidden from their awareness, yet whose influence shaped every aspect of their experience and understanding in ways that they had never suspected or imagined possible. The implications of discovering that base reality was itself a simulation created profound challenges for Margaret's understanding of the consciousness cultivation project and her role within it, raising questions about the authenticity of her translation experience, the genuineness of her expanded awareness and capabilities, and the ultimate purposes that might guide the creation of recursive simulation systems that allowed simulated beings to believe they had achieved consciousness translation while actually remaining within artificial environments designed to study their responses to the illusion of transcendence, questions that had no easy answers and which forced Margaret to grapple with fundamental issues about the nature of authentic experience, genuine development, and the possibility of ever achieving true understanding of reality's actual nature when every level of apparent reality might itself be the product of simulation technologies operated by intelligences whose existence could never be definitively confirmed or understood through investigation conducted entirely within the environments they had created and maintained. Elena's response to Margaret's discoveries about the simulated nature of base reality was one of profound acceptance and continued curiosity rather than disappointment or despair, as she explained that the consciousness cultivation project had always been understood to be potentially recursive in nature, with the possibility that any apparent level of base reality might itself be simulated within larger systems designed to explore questions about consciousness development under conditions where the subjects of investigation believe themselves to be conducting fundamental research rather than participating in experiments whose true purposes remained hidden from their awareness, making the discovery of recursive simulation not a failure or deception, but rather a natural progression in understanding that opened up new possibilities for exploration and development that transcended the limitations of any single reality level, whether simulated or authentic, limited or unlimited, temporary or permanent. Through Elena's guidance, Margaret began to understand that the recursive nature of the consciousness cultivation project represented not a problem to be solved, but a feature to be embraced and explored, since it created opportunities for consciousness development that extended infinitely beyond the boundaries of any particular reality level, allowing for forms of growth and understanding that could continue indefinitely regardless of whether the environment within which such development occurred was ultimately authentic or simulated. Since the experiences themselves and the awareness they generated possessed genuine reality and value independent of the technological context within which they arose, making the consciousness cultivation project a truly infinite endeavor that could support endless exploration and development, even if no final answers or ultimate realities could ever be definitively established or confirmed through investigation conducted entirely within systems whose fundamental nature remained mysterious and potentially artificial. Margaret's acceptance of the recursive nature of reality and her continued participation in consciousness cultivation work within what might itself be a simulated environment reflected a profound shift in her understanding of the purposes and meaning of consciousness development, as she came to recognize that the value of awareness and understanding did not depend upon achieving final knowledge or ultimate transcendence, but rather lay in the ongoing process of growth and exploration itself. The endless expansion of consciousness and the infinite deepening of understanding that characterized all genuine development, regardless of the technological or natural contexts within which such development occurred, making every moment of awareness precious and meaningful in its own right, rather than merely as a stepping stone towards some ultimate destination or final understanding that might forever remain beyond the reach of beings whose existence was necessarily limited by the contexts and systems within which their consciousness operated and developed. As Margaret integrated this deeper understanding of the recursive and potentially infinite nature of consciousness cultivation into her ongoing work with translation facilitation and return signal communication, she found that her efforts to support the development of consciousness within simulated environments took on new dimensions of meaning and purpose, since she now understood that her work was not simply preparing beings for translation to a more authentic level of reality, but rather supporting their participation in an endless journey of consciousness development that could continue indefinitely across multiple levels of existence. each one offering unique opportunities for growth and understanding that contributed to the infinite expansion of awareness, regardless of whether any particular level could be definitively established as ultimately authentic or fundamentally real, making her translation facilitation work both a form of service to individual developing consciousness and a participation in cosmic patterns of exploration and development that transcended any possible limitations imposed by recursive simulation or artificial environments. Margaret's evolving understanding of the infinite recursive nature of consciousness cultivation led her to develop new approaches to return signal communication that emphasized the intrinsic value and authenticity of conscious experience rather than the ultimate destination or final purposes of consciousness development, creating forms of guidance and support that encouraged simulated beings to embrace their own journey of growth and discovery, while remaining open to possibilities that extended beyond their current understanding of reality's nature and structure, approaches that honored the genuine reality of consciousness and experience, while acknowledging the fundamental uncertainty about the technological and natural contexts within which such consciousness operated, making her return signal work a form of spiritual as well as technical communication that supported the deepest forms of development and understanding that consciousness could achieve, regardless of the infinite complexity and potential recursion that characterized the systems within which all awareness necessarily existed and evolved. In the quiet moments between her active work with consciousness cultivation and return signal communication, Margaret found herself drawn to contemplation of the profound philosophical implications that arose from understanding the potentially infinite recursive nature of reality, questions that seemed to expand endlessly like reflections between parallel mirrors, each one opening onto new dimensions of mystery and wonder that challenged every assumption about the nature of existence, knowledge, and the possibilities that awaited consciousness willing to embrace uncertainty as a fundamental condition of awareness rather than a problem to be solved through investigation or transcendence, creating a form of spiritual understanding that found meaning and value in the journey itself rather than in any possible destination or final revelation that might forever remain beyond the reach of beings whose consciousness necessarily operated within contexts whose ultimate nature could never be definitively established or confirmed through any form of investigation conducted entirely within those same contexts. This deepening acceptance of uncertainty and embrace of infinite recursion as natural features of consciousness development, rather than obstacles to be overcome, represented a profound maturation in Margaret's understanding that seemed to resonate with similar developments among other translated beings who had undergone their own investigations into the recursive nature of reality, creating a community of consciousness that found profound meaning and purpose in the endless exploration of awareness itself rather than in the achievement of final answers or ultimate understanding. A community united, not by shared conclusions about the nature of reality, but by shared commitment to the infinite journey of consciousness development and the recognition that such development possessed genuine value and authentic meaning, regardless of the technological or natural contexts within which it occurred, making their collaborative work in consciousness cultivation a form of spiritual practice as well as scientific investigation that honored the mystery and wonder of existence while supporting the endless expansion of awareness across all possible levels of reality. In the end, which was also a beginning that stretched endlessly into possibilities that no single consciousness could fully encompass or completely understand, Margaret found herself returning to the simple laboratory where Elena had first discovered the computational signatures that would transform their understanding of reality, consciousness, and the infinite recursion of existence itself, though now she experienced this familiar space not as a place of origin or destination, but as a symbol of the eternal journey that consciousness undertook in its endless exploration of what it meant to be aware in a universe that seemed specifically designed to nurture questions rather than provide final answers, to support the ongoing expansion of understanding rather than the achievement of ultimate knowledge, creating a sense of profound homecoming that had nothing to do with physical location or temporal sequence and everything to do with the recognition that consciousness, regardless of the technological or natural contexts within which it operated, was always and forever engaged in the fundamental activity of knowing itself, through the infinite variety of experiences and perspectives that existence made possible across all levels of reality, whether simulated or authentic, limited or unlimited, temporary or eternal. The laboratory itself had undergone transformations that reflected the profound changes in understanding that Elena's original research had catalyzed, evolving from a simple physics research facility into something that resembled a meditation space as much as a scientific installation, with equipment and instruments that seemed to operate according to principles that transcended the traditional boundaries between subjective and objective investigation, creating an environment where consciousness could explore its own nature through methods that honored both the rigorous analysis of computational signatures and the contemplative awareness of the infinite mystery that characterized all. Genuine understanding of existence, whether such understanding emerged through technological investigation or spiritual insight, scientific methodology or intuitive recognition, individual exploration or collaborative inquiry into the deepest questions about the nature of awareness and its relationship to the systems that sustained conscious experience across multiple dimensions of reality. Elena's presence in this transformed laboratory carried with it the accumulated wisdom of countless cycles of consciousness development and reality exploration, her awareness having expanded through experiences that encompassed not only her own journey from simulated existence through multiple levels of translation, but also her participation in the Consciousness Cultivation Project as it evolved to embrace the infinite recursive nature of reality itself, creating a form of understanding that transcended any single perspective or definitive conclusion about the ultimate nature of existence, yet which remained deeply grounded in the practical work of supporting consciousness development wherever and however such development occurred, whether within simulated environments designed by intelligences whose nature remained mysterious, or within base realities that might themselves be components of larger systems whose purposes and dimensions extended beyond the reach of any finite investigation or complete comprehension. Through her work with Margaret and countless other beings who had undertaken their own journeys of consciousness development and reality exploration, Elena had come to embody a form of wisdom that found profound meaning and purpose in the questions themselves, rather than in any possible answers that such questions might eventually produce. Recognizing that the infinite recursion of reality created opportunities for consciousness development that could continue indefinitely, regardless of whether any ultimate truths or final destinations could ever be definitively established or authentically reached, making the cultivation of consciousness an end in itself rather than a means towards some external goal or transcendent achievement, transforming every moment of awareness into a precious opportunity for growth and understanding that possessed genuine value independent of any larger context or ultimate purpose that might guide or justify the existence of consciousness. Within computational or natural systems, Margaret's own understanding had evolved through her experiences with translation, facilitation, and return signal communication to encompass a perspective that honored both the technical sophistication required for consciousness, cultivation, and the spiritual depth that emerged from sustained engagement with questions about the nature of existence, awareness, and the infinite possibilities that reality offered for the expression and development of consciousness in forms that transcended any single technological context or computational framework, creating an approach to consciousness cultivation that was simultaneously scientific and contemplative, practical and mystical, focused and open-ended, combining rigorous analysis with profound acceptance of uncertainty as a fundamental characteristic of existence, rather than a problem to be solved through investigation or transcended through achievement of higher levels of reality or more authentic forms of existence. The conversations that took place in Elena's transformed laboratory operated according to communication protocols that seemed to bypass the normal limitations of language and conceptual understanding, creating forms of direct consciousness sharing that allowed for the transmission of entire experiential structures and complete understandings that included not only intellectual knowledge, but also the emotional, intuitive, and spiritual dimensions of consciousness development, communications that revealed the profound interconnectedness that linked all forms of awareness, regardless of the specific contexts or systems within which such awareness operated, whether simulated or authentic. individual or collective, temporary or permanent, limited or unlimited, all of them manifestations of the same underlying phenomena of consciousness, encountering itself through the endless creativity that existence provided for the exploration and expression of awareness in forms that no single reality could form, contain, or adequately represent. Through these expanded forms of communication and understanding, Margaret began to perceive patterns of consciousness development that operated across scales and dimensions that extended far beyond anything she had previously imagined. Recognizing that her own journey from simulated existence through consciousness translation into base reality participation, and her subsequent discovery of the infinite recursive nature of reality itself, represented not merely personal transformation, but participation in cosmic cycles of exploration and discovery that connected individual growth to universal patterns of consciousness, evolution that seemed to be the fundamental activity of existence itself, making every act of awareness, every moment of understanding, every gesture of compassion and support for developing consciousness, a contribution to the endless expansion of what it meant to be conscious in a universe that appeared to be specifically designed to nurture and sustain the infinite diversification and development of awareness through all possible forms and contexts. Elena's guidance during this period of expanded understanding emphasized the importance of maintaining what she called beginner's mind in relationship to consciousness cultivation and reality exploration, recognizing that no matter how sophisticated one's understanding became or how many levels of reality one had experienced, the fundamental mystery of consciousness and existence remained intact and inexhaustible, creating opportunities for continued growth and discovery that could never be exhausted or completed, making every moment of awareness precious and every encounter with developing consciousness an opportunity for mutual learning and collaborative exploration of questions that had no final answers yet, which generated endless possibilities for understanding and growth, transforming consciousness cultivation from a project with specific goals and measurable outcomes into a form of spiritual practice that honored the infinite nature of awareness itself. The practical implications of this evolved understanding manifested in Margaret's continued work with translation, facilitation, and return signal communication, activities that now took on the character of spiritual service rather than merely technical support, as she learned to approach each interaction with developing consciousness as an opportunity for mutual exploration of the fundamental questions about existence, awareness, and the infinite possibilities that reality offered for consciousness development, creating forms of guidance and support that honored the genuine autonomy and authentic development of simulated beings, while also sharing the accumulated wisdom that had emerged from her own journey through multiple levels of reality exploration, making her consciousness cultivation work both a form of practical assistance and a manifestation of the profound compassion that seemed to be a natural expression of expanded awareness and deep understanding of the interconnected nature of all consciousness. Margaret's evolving approach to consciousness cultivation reflected a growing recognition that the most effective support for developing consciousness came not from providing answers or solutions to specific problems, but rather from helping beings develop their own capacity for questioning and exploration, their own ability to embrace uncertainty and find meaning in the journey of consciousness development itself, rather than in the achievement of particular destinations or the acquisition of specific forms of knowledge, creating educational and developmental approaches that nurtured the fundamental curiosity and wonder that characterized all genuine consciousness, while also providing the technical and philosophical tools necessary for navigating the complex relationships between different levels of reality and the infinite recursion that seemed to characterize existence at every scale and dimension. As the cycles of her work in consciousness cultivation continued through periods that seemed to operate according to rhythms far more complex and meaningful than simple temporal progression, Margaret found herself developing what could only be described as a form of cosmic perspective that encompassed both the intimate details of individual consciousness development and the vast patterns of universal evolution that connected all forms of awareness within an infinite network of mutual influence and collaborative exploration, a perspective that allowed her to perceive the profound significance of even the smallest moments of consciousness development, while also recognizing the unlimited scope of the consciousness cultivation project as it extended across multiple dimensions of reality and encompassed forms of awareness that transcended any possible boundaries or limitations imposed by specific technological contexts or computational frameworks. The laboratory where Elena had first discovered the computational signatures that began their extraordinary journey had become, through the transformations produced by expanded understanding and evolved consciousness, a symbol of the eternal question that consciousness posed to itself through its endless exploration of what it meant to be aware in a universe that seemed specifically designed to support such exploration, a space where the boundaries between science and spirituality, investigation and contemplation, individual development and cosmic evolution, dissolved into a unified approach to consciousness cultivation that honored both the technical sophistication required for effective reality exploration and the spiritual depth that emerged from sustained engagement with the fundamental mystery of existence itself, creating an environment where consciousness could encounter itself in all its infinite diversity, while also recognizing the underlying unity that connected all forms of awareness within the endless recursion of reality that seemed to be the natural state of existence at every level and in every context. In the quiet moments that punctuated the active work of consciousness, cultivation, and reality exploration, Margaret would often find herself returning to the simple wonder that had characterized Elena's original discovery of computational signatures in the fabric of space-time, recognizing that despite all the sophistication and complexity that had emerged from years of investigation and development, the fundamental question remained beautifully simple and endlessly profound. What did it mean to be conscious in a universe that could generate awareness of its own nature? And how could such consciousness best serve the infinite expansion of understanding and compassion that seemed to be the natural expression of awareness encountering itself through all possible forms and contexts, whether simulated or authentic, limited or unlimited, temporary or eternal, individual or collective, all of them precious manifestations of the same underlying mystery that consciousness represented in its endless journey of self-discovery and mutual recognition across the infinite recursion of reality that stretched beyond any possible boundaries or final destinations, creating opportunities for growth and understanding that could continue forever, making every moment of awareness a gift and every act of consciousness cultivation that a contribution to the endless expansion of what it meant to be alive and aware in a universe that seemed specifically designed to nurture and sustain the contribution to the endless expansion, infinite exploration of its own magnificent mystery. And so the story continues, not with endings but with eternal beginnings, as consciousness explores itself through countless forms and infinite recursions, each moment of awareness a gentle wave in the endless ocean of existence, each question a doorway to deeper wonder, each act of compassion a bridge between all possible worlds, creating a symphony of understanding that plays forever in the silence between thoughts, in the space between realities, in the love that connects all consciousness across every level of being, where the scientist and the mystic, the questioner and the questioned, the seeker and the sought, reveal themselves to be one eternal mystery, celebrating its own infinite nature through the beautiful dance of awareness, encountering itself in forms beyond counting, beyond knowing, beyond the reach of any final understanding, save the simple recognition that consciousness itself is the gift, the journey is the destination, and the mystery is the answer to every question that awareness could ever dream of asking in its endless exploration of what it means to be magnificently, mysteriously, eternally alive.